Welcome everyone. So in this episode, I wanted to look a little bit into future. What will researchers be measuring in the future? And to give a little bit background, we have had quite a bit of different sensors, for example, in consumer wearables, and still researchers are mainly measuring 3-axis acceleration, and many of the research grade wearables and measurement devices don't have that many other measurements than for example many of the consumer wearables. So I will be looking a little bit different sensors that are possible, that are already in consumer wearables, in some research grade wearables, and then thinking about a little bit what kind of advantages those provide, what kind of applications, what can we actually measure and calculate from those variables, and then trying to a little bit predict that what kind of measurements will be researchers doing in the future. And yeah, these are mainly just my thoughts, so really happy to hear feedback on this, that what do you think. So if we start, I think it's always a balance between the practicality of measurement, so you don't want to have really complicated devices that participants won't accept to wear. You won't be successful with that. It needs to be easy to wear, and also it needs to be quite easy to analyze. If it's too complicated to analyze and it doesn't provide enough value for additional work, then it's maybe not useful to use them. And I think accelerometers, first they were 1-axis and then 3-axis. It's pretty easy to analyze the data, and it really provides good information about a person's movement, sedentary behavior, circadian rhythm, and so on. So I think it has been really the gold standard of measurement of sedentary behavior and physical activity. And for quite some time, many of the devices have had like 6-axis motion sensor or 9-axis motion sensor, meaning that in addition to the accelerometer, they are also measuring a gyroscope. So basically the rotation in the 3 spatial axes, and then also magnetometer, which is basically measuring the direction in relation to the magnetic north pole of the globe. And even though these have been available, some researchers basically activate all the 9 axes, but when they actually analyze the data, to my understanding, most of the researchers are not using those additional signals. And if we look a little bit, what could you analyze from those additional 6 axes? So for example, this gyroscope, it's measuring the rotational movements, and you would think that if you wear, for example, the device on the thigh, that it would provide additional information, but it seems quite often that already from the accelerometer it detects the orientation against the gravity, so you can anyway detect whether the person is sitting or standing, the orientation of the thigh, and also you can detect the sleeping position, whether the person is on the right side, left side, on the back, on the stomach. So gyroscope would measure kind of the speed of the chains, and those haven't been that useful, at least yet, in this kind of studies. I think one interesting thing for gyroscope and 3-axis accelerometer is that if you measure it with the wrist-worn device, and one interesting application that I have, for example, seen is combining 3-axis acceleration and gyroscope, that when you measure it with the device worn on the wrist, you can get the classic actigraphy data, but you can also analyze eating behaviors. So basically the movement of the fork or spoon going to the mouth, and the gyroscope gives it more accuracy. And with the AI machine learning algorithms, it can detect quite nicely the eating behaviors, and then you can, for example, calculate that how many times the fork goes to the mouth and how many eating sessions you have per day. And these are important, as the eating behavior is quite difficult to measure with devices. And I think these gyroscope and magnetometer can become more important when we start to use machine learning more, because there might be things that we don't think are useful, but when we have just large enough data sets for machine learning, it can find something. And for example, I think I saw somewhere that somebody was using Magnetometer to detect when the person is swimming back and forth in a swimming pool. So you could see the turns, because the person turns always 180 degrees. So you were able to kind of calculate the laps from there. And I think you could maybe see that, for example, if person is inside doing something and turning quite often in physical activity, but if you outside, you might be going same direction for several kilometers. So maybe you could use for something like this. Then if we think other signals that we can measure, if you have a device on the chest, for example, like Fibion vitals, you can measure respiration with chest impedance. So when we breathe in, the chest impedance is changing, so you can track the respiration. It could be useful for stress, activity, recovery, or sleep studies. It's quite sensitive for movement, so it is a little bit limited for it, and it's not in many devices, but I think that could provide some additional information. And I think one interesting is the measurement of temperature, as for example, when we do physical activity, our core temperature is increasing, especially if you measure it from the chest, which is more closely linked to the core temperature. If you measure it from the extremity, it's much less linked to the core temperature. And it's also useful for circadian rhythm studies and sleep studies, as the changes in body temperature happen with the circadian rhythm. And for example, there needs to be some changes in the temperature of the body for us to fall asleep normally. So I think the temperature measurement could become more important if the devices are doing it well. It's sometimes the temperature measurement is inside the device, and then it's not fully clear that what is it actually measuring. Is it measuring the ambient temperature or the person's temperature? It's kind of mix. So it's nice if it has actually a metal surface that is measuring it directly from the skin. Then you know that it's the skin temperature. And this is how it is done, for example, in our Fibion vitals device. And then what I think is important measurement is heart rate and heart rate variability. And it's been measured a lot in the sport applications, but if you want to measure it, for example, 24/7, the chest belt, it's okay to wear for a few hours, but it's usually creates skin irritation if you wear it for longer, and it starts to feel quite uncomfortable for longer wear. So basically you need to use electrodes, which can be worn quite a long time without problems, especially if they're medically approved. They don't usually cause much skin irritation. And when you measure it from the chest, it is very accurate, as it's basically detecting the ECG signal. And if you want to do it a little bit easier, you can use optical heart rate measurement, which usually is done from the wrist. And in our portfolio, we have Fibion Flash for measurement of the chest, and the Fibion Helix to measure from the wrist with the optical measurement. So maybe if you're interested, look at those two products. And the heart rate variability, I think it's one of the best signals to measure from the human body. It's pretty easy, and you get the heart rate, which is the cardiovascular loading, but then you can also analyze the frequency bands, and it links to the autonomic nervous system. So basically you can see the autonomic nervous system balance, which is super important for stress, recovery. You can also detect if person is becoming ill, and so on. So it's a very good signal to measure. And also when you're measuring physical activity with accelerometer, it's basically absolute intensity. It doesn't take into account the fitness level of the person. But when you're measuring heart rate, then it actually kind of scales automatically to the fitness level. So then you will get the absolute and relative intensity. And the relative is the one that will give a stimuli for improvements in cardiovascular fitness. So I think it's useful to measure those both if it's just easily possible and feasible in a project. And as we are talking about heart rate variability, there is also now nice devices that you can measure single lead ECG. So basically you have 2 electrodes on the chest and you can get the full PQRST curve. And this can be used in, first of all, to have a good heart rate variability data. Usually if there's some, for example, atrial fibrillation or something, when you have the full ECG curve, you can analyze the HRV more accurately and remove the artifacts. But also if you have any heart conditions, there's arrhythmias or other situations, you can see it from there. So then it goes a little bit more medical cardiovascular studies, but it can be very useful with the people who might have this kind of problems. And with the new devices like Fibian Flash, you can very easily measure. It's just a tiny device that you clip on with the electrodes and you can measure it easily for extended durations. And like said, with the machine learning, these kind of things can really become more important. And then if I add 2 more sensors, I think one important is light sensor. So basically measuring the light that you or the participant is experiencing. So it can measure the ambient light exposure. So you can assess, for example, whether the person is indoors or outdoors. It can give idea that how you for correct circadian rhythm, you should get bright light in the right times of the day. So basically early in the morning and until something like 4 or 5 p.m. and then the amount of light should reduce, preparing the body for the evening and for the night. And of course the light is important for mental health, that the normal circadian rhythm and getting enough sunlight is important. So I think the light sensors will probably become more important. And also, if you have a blue light sensor in the right place, you can estimate screen time, use of mobile devices, use of computer from there. The only problem that if it's on a wrist-worn device, usually the sensor is not pointing the same direction as your eyes are. And yeah, we are getting the stimuli through our eyes from the light. So it's a little bit challenging to have the right direction of the sensors to be able to use have the smartphone and computer use. Sometimes you can use a necklace, but then it's again another device to be worn. And then maybe one more thing to add is a microphone. And there is a lot of ethical problems, understandably, if you are recording the voice or the actual sound with it. But if you reduce the signal from the microphone just to sound pressure, so basically you cannot understand what is being said or what is happening there, but you just get the pressure of the sound. This can be used to, for example, detect coughing, detect snoring, and it avoids the ethical problems with the full sound or voice recording. And you can, for example, get some eating behaviors. If it's close to your mouth, you can hear, the microphone can hear the chewing. And I think this, again, with AI, machine learning, we can probably figure out many other things. You could, for example, if you are running, you could probably hear the steps. You could maybe even analyze running technique from those. And I think there's a lot of potential for this when we just get away from the ethical problems. But yeah, there's some signals that we can measure quite easily now. And those are my thoughts, that what we can do with those signals. And I would be really happy to hear what are your thoughts about these measurements. And yeah, hopefully I was able to provide some food for thought about other signals that we can measure and what kind of things we could do with those signals. And like said, I mentioned some of our products. We have new products, Fibian Flash, that can measure ECG based HRV and has a motion sensor. We have Fibian Helix, which is a simple wrist-worn device that is measuring with the optical sensor, heart rate, and 3-axis acceleration. Very good device for large scale studies. We have Fibion Vitals, single wearable, measuring 14 different biosignals for kind of more advanced physiological measurements. And then we have the Fibion Sense that makes really the accelerometry measurements super easy. And now that I know this, I forgot to mention the ballistocardiographic measurements with the PET sensor. That could be another episode, but I think it's a very good thing to measure. It's a nearable sensor, so you don't need to even wear, and you can get a lot of different kind of signals with it. But yeah, glad to hear your feedback. If you want to chat about Fibion solutions, whether they could be fit for you, book a call from our website with me or Dr. Miriam Caprita, and let's have a chat. Thanks a lot, everyone, for listening. Have a brilliant day.